Revenge films.
My name is Jessica Smith. At that time, I was living with my husband, Michael, my mother, and my 2 daughters, who were both in elementary school. My family began living together with my mother about 6 months ago. After my father passed away a couple of years ago, my mother had been living alone. However, recently it was discovered that her legs were not well and she was going to be disabled, so we decided to have her move in with us. However, I didn't want to burden my husband with taking care of my mother, so I didn't ask him for help in caring for her. In order to look after my mother, it meant that I had no choice but to decrease my hours at my part-time job. But even then, our family didn't struggle because of the insurance money and inheritance that my father had left behind. Thanks to that, my mother was putting in more than enough money into our household every month, and that helped us with our living costs. If anything, she was putting in more money than what I was making at my part-time job. So even if I had kept all of my hours, we were still getting about $1,000 more towards every month. I told my mom that there was no need for her to put in this much money and that if anything, I felt bad. But she insisted, saying that I was taking care of her and told me not to hesitate and just accept it. It was true that my mother's legs were getting bad and that she was physically less capable than before, but she tried to do anything that she could by herself around the house. She also took really good care of my daughters and spoiled them. She would buy them clothes and stationery, and when it came time for the first day of school, she also gifted them expensive backpacks, and they loved it. However, right around the time that my mother started living with us, my husband changed. Because we had more income, I started to feel like something was off with my husband, Michael. For example, as soon as it was the weekend, he would leave the house for long periods of time. And even when he would get his salary paid, he would use it all for himself and say,
"You're getting more than enough money from your mom anyway, so that's why you better not complain if I spend my own money and let me spend it the way I want to."
That's what he would insist. However, to begin with, as a father and as the main pillar of the family, I told him that he shouldn't be saying things like that. But then he said that because my mother was living with us, it was causing him a lot of stress, and that I shouldn't be the one complaining to him. I could understand that living with your mother-in-law might be uncomfortable, but my mother also seemed to understand that, and she was extremely thoughtful. She would try to spend as much time in her room and out of our way as possible. I felt like he just wanted to use it as an excuse for his actions. But there was a part of me that still felt bad that my mother was living within our family house, so in the end I wasn't able to say anything back to him. However, as time went on, Michael's actions only continued to escalate for the worst. He stopped putting in any money towards the family and spending it on himself. And then, when I would confront him about it and tell him that it was too awful, he would raise his voice to that everybody in the house could hear and say,
"It's too stuffy in here. I can't breathe when we have a disabled person like your mom in the house. That's why, if I don't blow off steam and let go of my stress outside of the house, I can't live."
I couldn't believe my ears. I told him to lower his voice and to not say things like that because my mother would be able to hear them, but then my husband started to realize that by saying things that would make me go quiet. And so that's how he would end the conversation and then storm out of the house. Of course, my mother had heard everything, and she came down to tell me that she would be fine to live alone, but I couldn't forgive my husband for his attitude towards my mother. The next day, my mother had an appointment at the hospital. In the morning, I took my 2 daughters to elementary school, and then I took her to the general hospital that was further away from my house. A few hours later, when we got home in the evening, my 2 daughters came running out of the house, panicked.
"Mom, I think there was a thief in the house!"
They said that to me, and I was shocked. I ran inside the house. And it was true. The entire house was a disaster. However, in an instant, I knew that this was all my husband's doing. That's because the first thing I noticed was that all of the drawers were opened, and his clothing was gone. And not only that, but when I went out to the living room, there was a neatly stacked pile of papers that were divorce papers. I understood then that he threw away his family and walked out on us. As I was trying to wrap my head around the situation, my mother came out of her room completely pale, and then she said, "Jessica, I had left my bank book and seal inside of my drawers, and they're all missing." When she said that, I was shocked. I didn't want to think it was true, but when I went back to my mother's room, it was clear that it wasn't just the living room and my bedroom that had been combed through. Even my mother's room was a disaster. And my mother's bank book, there was about $30,000 left in it. That was from my father's life insurance. That meant that my husband not only threw away our family and walked out on us, he even went and stole my mother's money. The first thing I tried to do was immediately call my husband, but just as I had imagined, he didn't answer at all. I don't know where he went after that, but then the next day, one of the older ladies that lived in the neighborhood told me that she saw my husband getting into the car yesterday with a woman she had never seen before, and that they drove off together. I had had a hunch that that might be the case, but it turns out that it was true. My husband was having an affair. Not only did he throw my family away and leave us, he had also stolen my mother's money, and I couldn't forgive him for any of that. I went straight to the police, but even after a few days went by, they weren't able to track down my husband or catch him. My husband was gone, and my mother's savings were also gone. Our family had nothing to live off of, and our lives instantly became a struggle. But I knew that the last thing I could do was to make my mother worry, so I picked up more hours and more jobs, and I did everything that I could to support my family. Because I was working around the clock desperately like this every day, I didn't notice that my mother was becoming weaker and that she had actually fallen under serious conditions. By the time I realized it, it was already too late. My mother was left with no choice but to be hospitalized. I tried to visit her as much as I could, but every time I did that, she would insist that I forget about her and that I needed to go take care of my daughters to be happy with them. And not long after that, my mother passed away. I was devastated. This was about 2 years after my ex-husband had left our family, and there was still no trace of him. After my mother passed away, it was discovered that my mother had left behind an insurance policy for me. After my ex-husband had run away with her savings and we didn't have my father's insurance money left, my mother only had the small amount of Social Security left. But she took that small amount, and in order to leave something behind for me and my daughters in case something were to happen to her, she had invested it into a policy. And with that, she left behind a couple $100,000 for us. I felt my mother's love and her thoughtfulness, and when this was all discovered, tears started streaming down my face. And then I found the last letter that she had left behind for me in her hospital room. There she wrote that she knew how hard I was working around the clock to support the family, and so she said that she wanted me to rest a little bit and to be able to spend some time with my daughters. I took her feelings to heart, and even though I hadn't been able to spend much time with my daughters, I decided to finally prioritize my time with them. I cut down my hours at my part-time job to the bare minimum, and I was supported by the money that my mother left behind for us. We were living happily like this. One day, out of nowhere in the afternoon, the doorbell to our apartment rang. I went to go answer the door, and I was terrified to see a homeless-looking man standing there. I panicked, and I tried to close the door immediately, but then he raised his voice and said,
"Wait a minute, Jessica, please! It's me!"
When I heard his voice, I felt an instant shock throughout my body. The man's clothes were completely dirty and worn out, and his hair was a mess. The homeless-looking man standing in front of me was none other than my ex-husband. I was shocked, but I gathered my composure and asked him what he could possibly want after all these years. But then he responded with the most unimaginable words.
"Hey, I heard that your mom died, right? And then you received a comfortable insurance policy, didn't you? Look, I've had a change of heart, so we can start over as a family of 4, right?"
That's what he said to me. The moment I heard those words, I felt the anger from 2 years ago start to boil inside of me, and I yelled. "Are you kidding me? After all these years, you ran off with my mother's money, and because of that, my mother died!"
That was my bad, but back then, things were hard for me, too.
He was talking to me like he wanted my sympathy, but as it turns out, after that, my ex-husband was having plenty of fun with his mistress using my mother's money. But of course, that wasn't going to last forever, and as soon as the money ran out, the other woman quickly threw him away. And then he was going around to different stations and parks trying to survive and escape the cold. That was when he overheard some of the ladies in the neighborhood talking about how my mother passed away and that they felt sorry for me. But then he also overheard that my mother had left behind the insurance money and that these days I was living happily with my 2 daughters. That was why he tracked us down and came here. My ex-husband seemed to think that he would be able to live easily with that money. And he said that he had a change of heart and that he wouldn't have an affair or cheat on me ever again for the rest of his life, so he wanted to start over. That's what he was saying, but who on earth would want to start over with a guy like him that only had his eyes on the money? I told him that I had no intention of getting back with him. But my ex-husband knew that the bank book holding the money was in the house, so he shoved me over with his 2 hands. I lost my balance and fell over, and I hit my head on the corner of the furniture and started bleeding. but I didn't pay any attention to that. With blood streaming down my face, I ran into the house. My ex-husband had barged into the house, and he was throwing open all of the drawers, demanding to know where the bank book was. He was looking around, so I took that opportunity to report him to the police. My ex-husband was desperately looking for the bank book, but a police officer from the nearby station immediately came, and he was arrested on the spot. Because I said I wasn't going to get back with him, he probably thought he could just steal the bank book even if it meant hurting me. We were married before, but now he was a total stranger. So because he trespassed into our property and he caused me harm, and he was also trying to steal, and even though we were family, he stole from us before, so he was quickly placed behind bars. My ex-husband said to me,
"You're the only one that gets to take so much money! You better give some to me!"
He was yelling, but I'm sure he would be many years in prison. Seriously, take that.
How was today's video? If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Stay tuned for more.